the Royal Institution, we believe that science shapes our lives, our culture, and the world around us. For more than 200 years, we have been creating opportunities for everyone to discover, discuss, and critically examine science through our innovative public events, world-famous Christmas lectures, YouTube videos, and cutting-edge education programs. Become a member of the Royal Institution today and help us to inspire everyone to think more deeply about science and its place in our lives.
The world of disciplinary silos is over. The era of the polymath has arrived. Hosted virtually in the first 2 weeks of February, the Polymath Festival brings you many of the world's leading intellectuals, entrepreneurs, and creatives, who, over the course of 40 unique events, will convene to celebrate the many sides of human potential and explore interdisciplinary solutions to complex world problems. Be a part of the future of education, the future of work, the future of mind. Join us for an intellectual experience of a lifetime.
Hi everyone, I'm Martin and I'm the Public Programme Manager at the Royal Institution, and welcome to tonight's stream. I'm very excited to introduce tonight's event with Sandberg Waqas Ahmed, which we're doing in partnership with the Polymath Festival. So hold on for a little bit, I'll tell you a bit more about what that is at the end of my little intro. Just to mark your calendar, don't forget on Thursday, we've got the fantastic neuroscientist Dean Burnett talking about why mental health goes wrong and how to make sense of it. And Dean's fantastic, so I really don't think you're going to want to miss that one. As always, a big welcome to members and patrons of the Royal Institution. In case you didn't know, anyone in the world is welcome to join the Royal Institution. You don't need to have any qualifications, you don't need to be nominated, you just need to like science, like what we do, and want to support our work. And as always, we're really grateful for our members who are sticking with us when, to be honest, they're not getting as many benefits as they normally get in terms of reduced ticket prices and discounts in our cafe and lots of other things that unfortunately we can't offer at the moment. So thank you so much for sticking with us. We really appreciate it. Secondly, some of you might be watching on different platforms on Eventbrite or YouTube or whatever. So if you're watching on one of those platforms, if you're watching not on YouTube, you might not see the chat box. So if you do want to see the chat and you want to type questions for our speakers later, do just click on the YouTube logo in the video that you're watching. That should take you to the YouTube website, and then you can type stuff into the chat, introduce yourself. We've already had lots of people introducing themselves. Very international crowd today. So hello, wherever you're watching all over the world. I've seen Vietnam, I've seen Indonesia, where it must be pretty late at night. I've seen Nepal and a few other exotic places as well. Turkey, I think. So congratulations to you from joining in wherever you are. Don't forget that the Royal Institution is a charity, so unfortunately we are struggling a bit at the moment, so we would be really, really grateful if you are able to donate us some money. If you enjoy the stream, we'd really, really appreciate it. It will help keep us going for another 222 years. So finally, I did mention earlier that we're doing this event in partnership with the Polymath Festival. It's the first time it's been run. In fact, it was due to take place, and this event was due to take place about sort of 10 months ago. But brilliantly, it's been rescheduled and it's taking place now from the 1st to the 14th of February. In case you don't know, it's a landmark festival of ideas, exploring connections between different fields, disciplines, and cultures. There's over 40 events, world-class speakers and performance. And I've looked down the list, some great people. You've got Heston Blumenthal, you've got Gillian Tett from the FT, who's great. Who else did I see there? Noam Chomsky's doing something. I'm sure I've missed loads as well. But anyway, they've got loads of great names speaking, so do check it out. There's some links I think will pop up in the chat. And I just wanted to say a little bit about why I think it's important that the Royal Institution got involved, why it really appealed to us. And that's that although obviously the Royal Institution is a scientific organisation, we're renowned for our most famous scientists and scientific demonstration lectures and the Christmas lectures, actually, ever since 1799, anyone has been able to come to the Royal Institution. It's not been exclusively for scientists to attend. In fact, women have attended the Royal Institution ever since our founding. So we have always been that place where people from outside of science could come and hear the latest theories, discoveries, and then sort of be inspired by them and take that away and maybe use something in their own practice and their own work. And in fact, more specifically, former professors of the Royal Institution, very famous scientists that made world-changing discoveries, such as Humphrey Davy or Lawrence Bragg, actually also had an interest in the arts. So Humphrey Davy was pals with the Romantic poets of the time, your Coleridges and your Shelleys, and he wrote some poetry himself. Wasn't very good, but he was also a poet. And Lawrence Bragg, as I mentioned, won the Nobel Prize for his discoveries in X-ray crystallography, but also painted some pretty nice watercolors, which we have in our archive as well. So again, I think the distinction between arts and sciences is kind of a false one. Sort out my cable there. And the Royal Institution, I think, has always taken comments and taken ideas from outside of scientists and never really seen distinction. So, for example, in the 20th century, Yehudi Menuhin, H.G. Wells, Pevsner, the architecture critic, and many others from outside of science came and presented at the Royal Institution to sort of share their ideas. And similarly, in more recent times, we've had the likes of Grayson Perry and Ian McEwan coming in to talk about their reaction and response to science. So it's just a really fitting, I think, that the Royal Institution is able to sort of be one of the first events in the Polymath Festivals. I do really think we are the home of people that are interested in lots and lots of different things. I certainly count myself as someone who just is interested in a whole range of things, from cricket to particle physics and many other things. So anyway, with that kind of spirit of multidisciplinarity and arts and science communication in mind, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome the director of the Polymath Festival, who's going to be chairing this evening, Waqas Ahmed. Hi, Waqas.
Hi, Martin. Thank you so much for that introduction. And you know what? I don't really need to say much else. The reason why the Polymath Festival has partnered with the Royal Institution is quite self-evident, given the interdisciplinary tradition that has existed in that institution for centuries. So, as Martin mentioned, we were supposed to have this as a physical event, and it was. We're not quite in the great lecture theatre, which I haven't visited, by the way. You must visit. It should be on your bucket list because it's a real experience to attend one of the events there. But nonetheless, we're adapting. We're here in our living rooms, in our offices, or wherever we are in the world, and we're trying, nonetheless, to expand our minds and to grow as individuals and to grow as societies. And speaking of which, today's event and today's theme is really striking at the heart of the future of humanity, the future of you and I. And indeed, the special guest we have today is a fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford. And he is a fascinating scholar because he is somebody who's at the forefront of thinking about what's going to happen when we become, or when life becomes increasingly automated, when artificial intelligence plays a greater role in decisions, in day-to-day life, in our jobs, in our education. There's not enough thinkers thinking about this in any great detail or any real criticality. And so we're really lucky to have somebody who's really spending much of his time questioning these things and trying to explore solutions and scenarios. And so I'm not going to say much else, except that this has profound implications for the future of work, the future of how we educate ourselves and our children and grandchildren. So this is not just a fascinating discussion, but a really pertinent one. And so let us go on now to Anders Sandberg, who will deliver a short presentation, after which we'll have a discussion and then open it up to the virtual audience. And so if you do have any questions or comments, do type it into the chat if you can, and we will do our best to address it later on. Anders, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here virtually. I would, of course, even more have wanted to be in the lecture theatre, which is kind of sacred nerd ground. I remember the first time I was there, I wanted to kiss the floor, but I felt that Michael Faraday had probably spilled some mercury on it, so it was probably best not to do it. Now, my background is the typical mixed background you end up at the Future Humanity with. So I started out studying computer science, and then I did a degree in computational neuroscience. And then I got interested in enhancement of humans and the ethics of that. And then I ended up in Oxford, starting to look into everything from global disasters to questions about how do we reason when things are super uncertain. And a little bit of the philosophy has rubbed off on me. Technically speaking, the Future of Humanity Institute is part of the philosophy department. And one of the most annoying things about philosophers is that you ask them a question, and then they start picking it apart, and then they turn it into a different question that they answer. So I'm going to play around a little bit with this question, the value of the human in the age of automation, and picking at it, and hopefully picking it apart in a useful way, getting off on a tangent, and then hopefully, if everything works out as it should, coming back to the question about polymaths and what kind of jobs should we get. But of course, I've been told that you should always tell the punchline from the start. And that is, of course, you should not have a job that can be described. That's the trick. Try to find a job that cannot be described, and then you're set. So now you can all fall asleep if it's too late in the evening or something else. But when we start thinking about that question, what is the value of a human in the age of automation? You can both ask, well, what's the value of humans? Or we can ask the value of being a human, or even the value of humane. And then the kind of answers that you can answer that big question, I think there are three main kinds of answers. The first one is the unwelcome answer, saying there is no value of humans. Everything a human can do, a machine can do better and more cheaply. Hence, it's going to be that we're gradually substituting human jobs for machine jobs. We're going to get way more productivity, and whoever owns the machines is going to get very happily rich. And eventually, of course, it's not just that their own sense of self deflates, but actually the human workforce gets smaller and smaller. And depending on how far you want to push this into the future, you might envision a future where there is a lot of unemployment, over to a future where there actually aren't any humans. Why should anybody use a human for any job? So actually, who would be paying for the humans to subsist? You can imagine some trillionaire who happens to own some patents for these machines, and out of charity giving a little bit of nice money to keep humans, perhaps even in a utopian post-scarcity world. But most of economy is not going to be human at all. It's going to be machines talking to other machines, making stuff, and probably the business-to-business sector in this scenario goes off to colonize the universe exponentially. The stock market goes well, except that the human part of economy approaches zero. There might be humans around, but they don't matter at all. And most of us probably don't really like that scenario. It sounds bad. It sounds inhumane. So the second kind of answer to the question is, of course, the desired answer. Oh, yes, humans are going to be more valuable than ever because machines complement our jobs. Sure, you can replace a human in a job with a machine, but typically add some form of automation, and now a human plus a machine can do much more and do better things and new things. At this point, of course, economists who are a little bit on the first answer side and the second answer side start quarreling with each other. Indeed, I've been to artificial intelligence conferences where even the people who disagree very profoundly about the right way of making machines smarter or how to do it safely end up having a nice, warm, fuzzy consensus in the panel debate. You find that the economists, they don't reach a consensus. They're disagreeing as much when they leave as when they came in. And I think the honest answer is we actually don't know. It's probably a good idea to try to hedge one's bets here. But in this nice scenario, what happens is we automate a lot of work, which means that the work gets changed. But we still get an enormous productivity. We might still end up in a kind of post-scarcity society where we get not just material amenities, but also a lot of services. There are still some clouds here. For example, David Graeber, the sociologist, coined the concept of bullshit jobs. Not all jobs are needed. There is actually a fair number of jobs, he argued, that are absolutely unnecessary, yet a lot of people are doing these jobs. They are aware that they're doing something pointless, but they have to get paid. And of course, we might envision in the nice future where we can complement humans with machines, that nobody is going to have a bullshit job. I fear that the opposite might be true. Now it might be easier than ever to have these bullshit jobs with very fancy titles that make it look very good for the CEO, because he's surrounded by so many people with interesting titles, and they are essentially there to make him look impressive. But there is a third kind of answer to the question of the value of a human in the age of automation, and that is the awkward answer. Actually, there is some value, and it's going to be greater or lesser in different domains. Actually, it's complicated. And as you can guess, this is where I end up. And I think one way of seeing that is to start thinking about the kind of automation we're already getting. So the classic idea of artificial intelligence was, let's try to make a machine that can think like a human. Now, the story about machinery in general, of course, is quite long. It began when we started taking parts of our environment and make them do our bidding. We made tools. Then we made environments that were not exactly doing our bidding, but at least much nicer than the natural environments. We made dwellings that are warm and dry and comfy and doesn't let the insects in too much. We made agriculture, an environment where almost all the plants are producing something edible rather than producing more plants. The next step was, of course, to outsource action. We started using animals to pull things. And then we got machines, and now we outsource a lot of muscle action. The next step is, of course, doing this with mental actions. Now, the interesting thing here is that you don't necessarily need to outsource everything going on in a human's head to do something useful. Indeed, a lot of the software that is underpinning tonight's entertainment is not at all like thinking. It's compressing data, it's transmitting data, it's drawing it. But it's very different from when a human is trying to sort through information and give a succinct description or draw a picture. Although it would be very interesting to imagine a Zoom call run by some kind of artistic AIs that try to describe what's going on to each other and then paint a picture of it, it's probably more artistically interesting than useful. And the interesting part here is, of course, the goal of true artificial intelligence immediately led to important questions about what the heck is intelligence itself. One of the most important papers, both in philosophy and artificial intelligence, is, of course, Turing's 1951 paper, where he makes the argument that it makes sense to even talk about thinking machines. It's worth noticing today that that idea, once upon a time, was crazy. It's about a bit like talking about a dreaming tractor. That's not how things work. It's a type error. And Turing's masterful paper shows that actually by the year 2000, people might not quarrel with you if you start talking about thinking machines. He was right about that. Now, the problem here is, of course, even defining intelligence turns out to be hard. And I'm totally not going to spend too much time on it. I'm just going to cheat and steal my favorite definition, which is from Shane Legg, one of the founders of Google DeepMind. And in his work, he defined intelligence as the ability to solve problems to reach your goals in general environments. So it's one thing that I'm pretty good at solving my problems in my own office. But I'm generally intelligent if I can also solve problems that emerge if I'm out in the street or find myself in the jungle. Now, some systems are more generally intelligent than others. Humans are pretty general, and we're going to come back to that quite a bit. An ant is very, very well adapted to its forest environment, but probably doesn't do very well when you try to put him into academia and try to see, can the ant write a good philosophy essay? You can't train ants to do that, even though recently we apparently got spinach to send email. But again, the initiative was from researchers rather than the plant itself. Now, the interesting thing here is, what is reaching your goal? Well, that's about steering the future. Intelligence by its nature is kind of futuristic. We're thinking about how the world could be, and then we try to do things to make it a little bit more like that. We don't have that much intelligence, but we have enough to totally transform the world. And now we're transforming our own social environment. So right now, one of the greatest results in modern artificial intelligence is the deep neural networks, which are basically solving perception. I'm putting big square quotes here because I know Gary Marcus, who said that originally, wouldn't actually agree with it completely. It's not like the perception of these deep neural networks is anything like ours. It's not like they understand the things we understand. But we certainly know enough when you train them on data to do a lot of jobs. And indeed, it looks like we're going to be living in a world that's totally transformed by that within a few years. Face recognition is already much bigger, of course, in China than it's in the West, where we have some quibbles about privacy. But generally, identification technology has been growing for a long while. It's not very far from the stage where everything and everyone can be identified remotely, automatically, all the time. That has a lot of implications, both for the police and for criminals, for thinking about how we monitor our environment and figure out what beetles and plants are out there, as well as what kind of wine is actually the best one coming out of a wine cellar. A lot of jobs that hinge on perception are going to be transformed this way. Another interesting demonstration is that when you do feedback systems in deep neural networks and use language, you can use this to generate low-level creativity. You can use it visually too, of course, to have systems that make fake pictures, like fake faces or fake anime characters or fake Airbnb sites. But perhaps the most impressive one was OpenAI's GPT-3 system that came out last year. Basically trained on a lot of text from the internet, you give it a seed text and it continues it. And it's remarkably good at making pastiche. I think we can argue that, yeah, it's not really creative. It's just making stuff that is very likely to continue. Give it a bit of legal text and it continues the legal reasoning. After a while, it gets confused. But GPT-3 is way better than GPT-2, which is 2 years old. And we should expect it to be equally good GPT-4 whenever that comes out. Indeed, it turns out that you can use it to generate low-level creativity. I found it was pretty decent at writing crime stories. It was very good at pornography, because that's pretty formulaic, unfortunately. It turns out that it can even invent new jokes, some of which actually I felt were funny and original. And at this point, I got this worry. Wait a minute, there is nobody in there. This is a system that's as stupid as a pile of rocks. Why am I finding its jokes funny? Normally, if I tell you a joke, you should be laughing because it is a funny joke and maybe I'm telling it in a funny way. But usually we assume there is somewhere a jokester who came up with a good story in the background. There is nobody around here. Yet that context of language, if you give enough samples, allows it to fake this form of creativity. And that's going to change a lot of things, because making at least simple jokes, filler text, that seems quite doable. I already been thinking a bit that maybe some of that really boring grant writing, I could outsource that to that network. My fear is, of course, that it's going to be read by another neural network. Indeed, it turns out that there are some software already working like that for grading student essays, which makes me a bit worried, because it doesn't quite understand what's going on. There is no representation of a higher level thoughts the students have. Except that, do we really know that? We even have questions about this kind of narrow AI. There are good questions about how much it truly understands and what we mean by understanding and what the right response is. Similarly, it looks like physical skills might become more and more doable. For a long time, robots were totally hopeless. We were talking about Moravec's paradox, that stuff 5-year-olds can do very well, like hold a pen and lift a glass of water without spilling, is really hard to teach a robot to do. While playing grandmaster chess, oh yes, that's not terribly hard. That's also starting to change. A lot of this is changing because we can just train using a lot of data, and we have a lot of sensors and cameras, etc. So this is suggesting a world where a lot of aspects, single aspects of perception and action, can be automated. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we're all out of jobs, because most jobs consist of different parts. It's just that parts of the jobs get very transformed. Now, general intelligence, on the other hand, would really change the game. And this is, of course, what artificial intelligence has truly been working towards. except of course all the actual money and the actual successes have mostly been in the narrow side. The people working on artificial general intelligence, in some sense, are searching for the original holy grail. But many people in the field think that, yeah, right, we're not going to see that. They're a bit crazy. Except, of course, that when the field moves forward rapidly, that lurch might make us a bit worried. Maybe we're actually on the verge to get there. Maybe if we just pile on enough training data and neural networks, we actually do end up with general intelligence, which could be very scary. Because as we who work on the safety of artificial intelligence know, it's very tricky to combine the moral values, the behavior you want, with the ability and the skill. It's fairly easy to make a piece of software that does something. It's much harder to make it do it safely, or while respecting privacy, without bias. Of course, if you say, oh, we need to train our neural networks so they don't become racist and biased, we can start working on that if we can define what racist and biased is. And I think in the past few years, we also have this shift that people are starting to become more aware that, yeah, maybe this form of automation can be dangerous on a global scale in a very different way from the killer robots of science fiction stories. People have been worried about killer robots ever since Frankenstein, who was, of course, organic, just like the original robots in Karol Čapek's play. But the problem is more like the Facebook algorithm optimizing for engagement than the Terminator. So you have an algorithm that does something totally reasonable to your company. Make sure people are posting a lot of stuff on Facebook and bring in their friends. As a side effect, you might get populism and misinformation and create an ecosystem that is bending the world in a bad direction. There is no real AI, I think, going on in this algorithm. It's simple optimization. But you can easily imagine adding more and more intelligence, perception, and you might now get error behaviors that are very subtle that we can't even recognize. So you get the company that optimizes its economic performance in some magical way that we cannot see, that it's also damaging the world in a very strange way. Now, adding human values to this, adding a realization that the algorithm understands that, oh, my owners actually wouldn't want me to do this if they could understand what I'm doing. And then have it actually want to change so it's aligned with the owners or humanity in general is super valuable and very, very hard. So when we start thinking about jobs, it seems like there are some jobs that we really morally should replace. Not just because they're dirty and dangerous and horrible, but sometimes because we just want to make them cheap. Just imagine if you could make a nurse robot or a doctor robot. Bad news maybe for doctors and nurses, but they could actually make medicine cheaper. We could distribute it much more widely across the world. We might have a very strong moral reason to try to do that. More likely, we're going to end up with some parts of medicine becoming automated and cheap, and hopefully we can then focus on the other parts that are harder to do well, which might involve empathy or common sense, etc. Another important aspect is, of course, there are some jobs that are symbolic. I sometimes joke that, well, priests, prostitutes, and politicians and prosecutors, they're safe. Why? Well, we care that there is a human doing that particular kind of job. In some cases, like the priest, it's because many people believe that humans have this particular property that robots cannot possibly have, and that allows them to do these things that a priest are supposed to do. Now, you might argue that maybe there are many other aspects of being a priest that you could automate in useful way. Similarly, prosecutors, I add them to the list because I'm married to a prosecutor. Actually, the legal reasoning might perhaps be better left to a machine one day. But you still want somebody to represent society in a court case. That representative aspect is quite important, even though it's not necessarily doing any heavy intellectual work. It's important that it's a person doing that. Unfortunately, in some cases, we put in people because we want to blame them. Now, the interesting part here is that a lot of these jobs work well when you can do a crisp description, then you can automate it. I met AI professors telling me with no uncertainty that explain what the job is about exactly, and my students can build it for you. And I think he's right. You can also do it if you have enough good examples that you can train on to automate. But this produces big data challenge, or enough good training examples. Maybe we can have a lot of examples of priests doing things, but that doesn't necessarily get to the core of what it means to be a priest necessarily. Maybe we can get a lot of examples of people being nice. Does that actually mean that we understand niceness? It might be that we get 90% of niceness, which might be good, but if we miss the important 10%, that's a problem. There might also be an ethics problem. So can we morally get enough training examples? We have this problem in healthcare. If we actually just put surveillance cameras in every doctor's office and gathered all the data into big database, we could probably train algorithms to do a lot of medical things cheaply and efficiently, except that we would kind of be infringing on people's privacy. I think you can make a good argument that, well, nobody's going to find out about Mrs. Brown's diabetes this way. It's just going to be melded into the big database. So this might be all right, but there are plenty of other things that are problematic. The really interesting thing is when you start looking at the jobs that look hard to automate, they involve finding new solutions. They're usually very creative. Right now, we might also say that they're strategic and intelligent, but the best ones also involve finding new problems. Realizing, oh, there's an unmet market need. I need to invent something that fulfills that. Or nobody is complaining about this thing, but I think there is a hole in the science here. That seems to be very important. And this is not just solving problems. This is detecting that there is something important that needs to be solved. It's not very hard for computers to generate diversity. It's much harder for them to figure out what's actually good. And that gets to the value part. Because it seems like much work is also about recognizing where value is, or sometimes disvalue, and then handle that in novel ways. The artist is making variations and noticing that particular stroke makes something very interesting, expresses something that nobody else has done. And a designer who comes up with something that people didn't know they needed, but now desperately need, is going to be a successful designer. But that requires not just common sense about the world, which is AI's weak spot right now, but might get better because you can train it, but also that you need to be a valuing being. You actually need to be some kind of entity that goes around and measures value in the world. And I think machines eventually can do that, but we're much better at measuring value in a human-like way. And right now, the customers are humans. Now, the fun thing is, of course, we are value-sensitive beings. And that means that thinking about terms of value and meaning is not just nice things to think about how we make the future better. It's also about how you actually make real hard cash from your systems. And it goes beyond that. I've been talking about jobs, but jobs are not all there is to life. Most of our life happens outside work. The ideal life probably involves some work, but a lot of things are not jobs. There are meaningful activities that need to be done, but they need to be done in other ways. So the interesting thing is, this is where I'm getting back to the polymath part. Artificial general intelligence is able to act in a lot of different domains if it can acquire information. That's also what we might say a polymath is. It's a human that can act in a lot of different domains. Except that all of us are polymaths to some extent, of course. It's just that some of us happen to be better in some domains. We tend to look up to polymaths in some domains and not in others. And an important thing that people tend to overlook is not just about skill and knowledge. It's also actually about priority and value. There is one German word that I'm kind of fear, and that is Luftmensch. It means literally air person. I desperately fear that I could be a Luftmensch. I want to do something important and meaningful for the world. Yes, I'm a dilettante in 1,000 different fields. I'm interested in everything from ceremonial magic to the history of Indonesia. But in the end, those pieces of knowledge, those projects need to lead to something that actually matters. And this goes back to actually knowing what you value. So to conclude, I think the value of humans in a world of automation lies in that we can see the world in very particular, unique, and contingent ways. And then we evaluate it from that perspective. Not always skillfully, not always even in a sane way. But these subjective, individual, and somewhat random approaches, together with our general intelligence, as well as our social ability to actually form intentions with groups of like-minded people to set out to change the world, That allows us to select the future and make a particular future we have envisioned more likely. It's worth noticing that many of the things we do are amazingly unlikely by the standards of normal physics. We are creating pure substances, pure water and pure glass that have various weird properties. We're making lenses out of glass that magnify things. That doesn't happen normally when sand is lying around. We organize other metals into nuclear warheads. We organize plants into agriculture, or do a bit of biotechnology, end up with fluorescent mice. We make trustworthy markets and Wikipedia. These are amazingly unlikely states of the world, and they are the result of human general intelligence stretching across different domains, saying that future could actually be valuable. And this is why I think human value in the age of automation will actually be great, because partially it is what actually gives the automation value, both in an economic sense, but also in a practical sense. But also, we're actually choosing the future. We're right now, if we just let things go as they go, we're probably going to end up in a very messy and not very good future. But we're also pretty likely to try to push the future towards better directions. We're going to be struggling because we're having different values about what the future should be. But I think we actually have a pretty decent chance of creating a very unlikely in the face of it, but likely in practice, amazing future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anders. That was riveting, enlightening, and actually quite inspirational, because when you're equipped with the knowledge of what could be, of course, you feel more empowered in terms of what you could do to work out the best scenario or the best options and priorities. Now, what really got me going was you did not speak so much about, many people who are talking about the future of technology often are talking about exponential growth in technology and exponential development of technology, to the extent that we hear a lot about the singularity, which I'm going to ask you about in a second, but also superintelligence and therefore the futility of human intelligence in its general sense. I want to understand, what are your views on the current narrative on the technological singularity, and when do you think that might be likely, and how much time do we have?
Yeah. So it's interesting because the idea of a technological singularity goes back a long while. It began, I think, when people started thinking that, look, it's this growth here, this economical growth is exponential. Why is that? Well, better machines, of course. And aren't we using machines to make better machines? I mean, a modern draftsman in the Victorian time would have a drafting table with various clever linkages allowing them to do various things. Sure, we might even use that Babbage Fellows device to make even better design. So already in the 1800s, people started to think about machines make machines. At which point, of course, it's very easy, as Samuel Butler suggested in his novel Erewhon, that you could actually have an infrastructure that grows on its own, in some sense independently of humans. Humans, according to him, would be only kind of the pollinators for the machines. He didn't exactly imagine a world run by the machines for the machines, but he was still noticing that evolution would be acting in this domain. For a long while, this was a general nice thought to discuss with a bit of brandy in the library after talking about other things. But then Alan Turing took it up to the next level, where he pointed out that if thinking machines are possible, of course they should be able to do things humans can do, including designing thinking machines. He was assuming they would just be learning very rapidly and soon leave us in the dust. One of his collaborators, I.J. Good, coined the term intelligence explosion in the 1960s, where he actually mused about the first ultra-intelligent machine and pointed out that it should be able to make an even more ultra-intelligent machine, and then it would take off very rapidly. And he, of course, noticed that we better make sure that we can control this, otherwise we're going to be in trouble. The term technological singularity was coined in the early 90s by science fiction author and the computer scientist Vernor Vinge. And I think he made a dangerous mistake here, because he conflated several things that are related but not quite the same. So I already talked about exponential growth. But you can have exponential growth just because the economy gets more effective and people are using many tools. You don't actually need that self-amplification inside the machine itself. The intelligence explosion is a very different form of enhancement. And it doesn't necessarily have to be super fast. You could imagine a very slow self-improving machine. But he also linked it to the idea of superintelligence. But of course, soon we're going to have things that are much smarter than us. And as a science fiction author, he realized, I can't write about it. It's kind of incomprehensible. So he also imagined it's a prediction horizon. When the singularity happens, we can't say what's beyond it. And that's also why he used this word that he took from mathematics. It's a point where the old rules break down and new rules start. And for a while, people were very happy to say we can't say anything beyond that. I think that's wrong. The law of energy conservation is going to be valid before and after. And the entropy is going to be a headache for superintelligence as well as for us humans building steam engines. So what has happened in the last few years is partially people got tired of the confusion about the singularity. So many people don't want to talk about it. And then others say, oh, look, we don't believe in the singularity anymore. Meanwhile, a lot of people in the AI domain got this shock in 2012 when suddenly the ImageNet competition went so much better. If you scale things up in the right way, suddenly things accelerate enormously. Nobody expected that. And there might be similar expansions of capability ahead of us that could make much more powerful systems. There are good reasons to think that we're going to apply more AI to designing AI. So things might be taking off, but it's very unclear what exact scenario we're talking about. And it's also historically rather clear that we're very bad at predicting the future of any domain that's idea-based, like artificial intelligence. So when Ray Kurzweil confidently tells us 2045, that's the year of the singularity, yeah, many of us in future studying, we kind of smirk at him. Although he's been very decent at some of his predictions, but they are usually about way more concrete questions. Predicting entire fields, especially when they deal with dynamics we don't understand, is very hard. And that leads to this other situation. You can say we can't say much about it, so we can just ignore it, which I think is totally wrong. Because if it's necessary to make a value alignment work for artificial intelligence before it gets too powerful, then we better do it early. If we don't know when the singularity or at least powerful AI arrives, we better work as if it happened tomorrow. We better have something ready if DeepMind tells us, well, actually, you know, we have this alpha int and it can solve practically every problem you give it. At that point, we better want to patch on some ethics or some way for it to figure out what humans truly want. On the other hand, if we have a century more to work, we can make something even better.
Yeah, and that's actually where I was coming to next, which is values and ethics. Because of course we have a lead time, don't we, until we get to that stage where superintelligence of some form arrives, some unpredictable form arrives. Now, until then, and I'm going to ask you about your prediction about lead time, but until then, we do seem to have some time, whether it's a generation, 2 generations or more. So during this time, we clearly have to program the AI with values or ethics. How do we arrive at universally acceptable values and ethics in order to do that?
Well, I'm at the philosophy department, and let's just say that we haven't solved this problem for 2,500 years. It's hard. It's a hard problem. It's a deep problem. It has a lot of complicated rabbit holes, which of course are also very distracting academically, because in many cases, solving very fine ethical conundrums might be more interesting than trying to figure out what can we put into a computer that we can live with. But there is also some interesting fundamental issues that AI is giving ethics that I think are going to be very valuable to philosophers. For a very long time, we always assumed that anybody that you could talk ethics with was a human. And all ethical beings would be human-like. Now, animal rights activists and philosophers have kind of given us reasons to think that actually there are other organisms that might matter morally, and some of them even have rudimentary behaviors that we might say, yeah, that's a little bit morality relevant or similar. AI gives us something that we could say, we have an inverse ethics problem. We can tell it to behave in a particular way. Which way should we tell it to behave? And it might not even be a person. It might not matter morally. We might be allowed to scrap our robots freely with a good conscience because we're actually not conscious, etc. Or it might be that we build systems that we actually do have to care about. Now, the problem here is I'm not feeling that 3 or 4 generations lead time is comforting, because so far we haven't made great progress in ethics. We have learned a lot of important things. Going from the pre-Socratics and Aristotle and Plato and throughout the Middle Ages and up to the Enlightenment and onto modern questions in metaethics, there is an enormous amount of knowledge, some of which is very valuable. But it's not really the right kind. I've seen literal computer engineers just shake their heads when philosophers explain an ethical system, because the engineer knows that cannot run on a Turing machine. I can't implement that even if I had infinite computing power. We have a problem here. Yet obviously we humans can handle ethics to some extent. And that gives hope. We know some systems, human, can be somewhat ethical. We also know that we have ways of training ethics. We have produced a lot of ethical texts, and it's embodied in a lot of our television soaps and dramas and novels. There is actually a lot of material that you can use to try to train systems on. But that, of course, still is going to lead to a problem that we might end up with systems that just are at first having our own ethics. We're still going to have an argument between the utilitarian and the deontological AI. Hopefully, they're also so much better that they might resolve some of the questions or come up with other things. But when we get to the next problem, maybe one day we get an email out of the cloud saying, the superintelligence have actually solved your ethics problem. Here is a list of 25 commandments that you just need to follow. You can't understand why they're true, but trust us. Do we trust? The actual thing is, of course, a lot of ethics is a social thing. If I deal with the cloud of superintelligence every day and find that it's actually generally nice and trustworthy, then maybe I'm going to follow the 25 commandments. If it's just a mysterious set of logical equations coming down from above, I might not want to trust it. I might say, yeah, I'm not going to keep to my old human ethics because I at least know how that works.
How interesting. So does that mean that we have to rely on the high priests of the current high priests of technologies and those that are funding those technologies, of course, a small minority of people? Should we be trusting in the ethics of those individuals?
I think there is an important question about how to build trust in general. Trust is probably the most scarce commodity in the world today. Oil, there is a glut of oil. Energy, oh yes, we're getting a really nice solar power, and I think renewables are doing a great job. Most metals, yeah, if platinum is getting scarce, there are ways of extracting it from less effective ores. Trust, on the other hand, is necessary for making your society work. If I need to expect that the guy selling me food is trying to fool me, I need to focus a lot on that transaction. And if he thinks I'm going to try to rob him, he needs to pay somebody with a gun to stand around the store. And the guy with the gun, of course, might decide to take over the store. A low trust society doesn't work very well. High trust societies have enormous reductions of friction and work really well. The problem is, of course, that trust builds up because we interact with each other, we tell each other stories about what is going on, we have arguments, and we develop it in a social way. Similarly, when you meet somebody, do you trust them? Typically, you start with your society's level of default trust, plus your own level of how much you trust other people. And then you update when you interact more and more. If they say nice things, if what they tell you turns out to be trustworthy and true, you tend to improve it. If they cheat you, well, then now you reduce it. The problem is, of course, when you encounter somebody you never met. Generally, we can automate some of the trust by having reputations online. The score you get on a Facebook post or a Twitter post or something you put on the physics stack exchange is actually giving some information. We can actually use automation to help build trust. Unfortunately, this is very early days. We're not good at it. And many of these trust systems both assign trust to people who shouldn't be trusted. Because, of course, conmen and the cheating politicians are always going to try to get trust, even though they're not trustworthy. And conversely, sometimes it doesn't assign trust to people who ought to be trusted, but they lack the right social skills. This is something, some technology that I think we should be working very hard on. But actually getting back to your proper question, should we trust the big AI company and its experts funded by some billionaire? Well, by their fruits you shall know them. You actually want to check, are they establishing trustworthiness? Are they being open? Are they having, for example, a clause saying that if we by chance happen to unleash the singularity and take over world economy, we're going to donate 10% of that value to everybody. A windfall clause is something we have proposed from our institute. It's something that we might want to actually put into corporate obligations. Most companies will, of course, scoff at that because they don't think they're going to trigger the singularity and own much of the world. But in that case, there is no loss to them to actually have that kind of legal obligation. But I think what you can do is you design structures to help trust. It's a bit like the magician, of course, who says, I have nothing up my sleeves. Normally, when I show that I have nothing up my sleeves, of course, that tends to indicate that I'm not going to cheat on playing cards with you. Of course, a magician is doing it because he is going to cheat, but he's going to cheat in a way that you also approve of in some sense if you go and watch a magician doing something. And so, to some extent, we want the same social framework to work around this. What we're worried about, I think, today is that the very powerful organizations and individuals might be unbound by social frameworks. And that's something we might want to work harder on figuring out better ways of doing. I think, unfortunately, most people tend to think that, yeah, the social framework needs to be like the one surrounding me right here. That's not necessarily true. There might be other better ways of framing things. The things that scare Google Corporation are not the same thing that scare me as a person. So we might want to construct frameworks that actually make powerful agents play nice. But we have, again, a lot of the knowledge about that. And we can probably design new automated methods to help monitor these powerful agents.
Oh, interesting. So how do we become, I suppose, technology or ethics or techno-ethics activists? How do we play our role as lay people to kind of, I guess, redress the imbalance of the distribution of power when it comes to technology and the future of technology?
I think the secret lies in drinking a lot of coffee and tea.
Okay.
I have a reason for this. So when you read something in the morning newspaper, people are making various claims. They might even, if it's a good newspaper, explaining the reasoning why they think that we should be doing this and that. Now, if you just accept that, you're not going to become very good at being an activist for technology or ethics. But if you drank enough of your tea, now you have a bit of energy to actually look up what did they actually say, because quite often the report in the newspaper is unfortunately not exactly what happened. You might want to follow up. Is this reasoning valid? You might actually have a bit of energy to discuss with your friends about. Generally, I find that the real problem is energy management. Obviously, we cannot follow up every claim we meet every day because the newspaper is full of it, the books are full of it, the internet is full of it. But caring about what seems to matter and digging into that, noticing who actually says things that do seem to matter and digging into, does this actually make sense? That is helpful. Now, the problem here is, of course, you have people like populists and conspiracy theorists who think they're doing that. Because many conspiracy theorists think they're actually digging into the truth of the world. And while they're making up a great story that makes them feel very happy that the world is actually run by the evil conspiracy, which means that it's actually run by somebody rather than just randomly happening, they're actually not doing a very good quality work on checking the knowledge. The real problem is we won't need to be intellectually humble. We need to know that we're fallible, we're doing stupid stuff all the time. That's, of course, why it's actually quite useful to recognize that we fall for things all the time. A lot of the things that are reported are not right. Sometimes maliciously, quite often just because somebody couldn't be bothered to fetch the right data. This is true both in science and in tabloid newspapers. Of course, in tabloid newspapers, there might be pure bullshit. In Frankfurt's in a sense that they actually don't care about what's true as long as it's very cool. But at least understanding that, is very helpful for evaluating information. What I think is happening right now is that we have this amazing challenge for the global civilization. We have had a global civilization for maybe 30 years or something like that. Before that, we were really isolated. Now we're starting to get linked up. And we got this amazing information processing and transmission system, except that we haven't got good filtering methods. We're falling for misinformation all the time. Rumors are spreading like crazy, and we don't know who to trust. Today, I've been bickering on Twitter a lot about the Swedish strategy against coronavirus. I'm not an epidemiologist, but I do think the Swedish chief state epidemiologist is seriously wrong because of a philosophy of decision theory issue. And I've been arguing that. I hope other people can look on the outside and say, yeah, that Anders guy is actually wrong about the epidemiology, right about the philosophy, or vice versa. So finding better ways of evaluating, either automatically, that would be so lovely if we could have little AI programs doing it, or by finding trusted sources, or just by learning it yourself, is necessary. And that's going to, unfortunately, require an awful lot of coffee and energy. I think quite often we just hope that somebody else will deal with the problem, and that's not going to cut it. The real secret behind being an activist is to realize, actually, I'm probably part of a problem. I need to do something about it.
Okay. So making ourselves more aware, more critically minded, more open-minded, and trying to do what we can in our own way to educate ourselves, and then assess, I guess, what contribution, big or small, we can make.
Yeah. And then build institutions, because if we're all doing it individually, nothing much is going to happen. If you think about the great improvements in how humanity has functioned over past history, many of them have been that humans form groups with a shared intention. Let's build an institution, whether that is an academy, something like the Royal Institution or the Royal Society. Let's set up rules so it doesn't break apart when the first sociopath joins. Let's add some rules of feedback so it doesn't go totally crazy when the first conspiracy theorist joins up. Let's add routines to make sure it can pay the rent. The Royal Society famously almost went bankrupt when it was trying to publish books because it gave out the natural history of fishes, which turned out to be not a bestseller. And when Hooke managed to convince, it was Edmund Halley, sorry. Edmund Halley convinced Newton that Principia ought to be printed. He had to pay a lot of it out of his own pocket, but that book changed the world. But of course, if the natural history of fishes had been handled a little bit worse, the Royal Society wouldn't even have been around at that point. So institution building is important. And the nice thing is that involves part of it social stuff, actually getting along with people, getting the people who work there. Some of it is economic stuff. How do you actually pay for the building? Some of it is going to be the informational stuff. What kind of information flows make sense? What are the website like? Some of it are going to be probably artistic stuff, like what's the vision here? How do you actually tell the future generation what we're trying to aim at and make them as impressed by this as we are? And that takes a lot of joint work. It's not just that we can individually sit and be smart, because that rarely works. Similarly, it doesn't work when you try to just homogenize everybody into a mass. You want to make use of each and everybody's particular skills. And again, it's not going to be optimal, but if it's good enough, when you get an industrial revolution, an enlightenment, or the computer revolution.
Before I ask Martin a couple of questions from the audience, the virtual audience that we have, I just have one more question for you, because I know that this would be on many of the audience's minds. I've had so many conversations about this. I want to get your views on the prospect of transhumanism, and obviously that being the synthesis of some kind of biology and technology, and how you think that might be playing out. It's a big topic, I know, but if you can summarize your view or your take on this, that would be appreciated, I think.
So in my potted history of technology a bit earlier, I kind of said, yeah, first we changed our environment more and more, and then we outsource various functions. But another form of technology is, of course, technology that changes ourselves. And the most obvious thing is, of course, medicine. We have things like glasses and tooth fillings that solve some of the awkward aspects of our biology. But some of these modifications don't just solve awkward aspects of our biology. We might want to do cosmetic surgery to look a bit better, or we might indeed take a cup of coffee or something stronger to try to think better. Or we might say, yeah, those gray hairs, that aging, my immune system is going down. Couldn't we slow down that aging? There are good reasons to want to turn our technological ability onto ourselves, which of course means that humans in some sense are also becoming increasingly cultural artifacts. And to many, that's a very scary thought. Again, the whole debate about transhumanism is very fun because it reveals so much about what people think is truly human. So on one hand, there are people thinking that there is some human essence, and if you tamper with stuff, then we might lose it, and then you get some kind of soulless automaton or something worse. Others, and I'm more like them, would say actually trying to change oneself is very human. We are already cultural beings. The way we think is not very much based on just biology. It's because we heard stuff from our parents. It's because we read stories in books. It's because we have sought out various information sources and built a mind in various ways. Why shouldn't we also try to build a mind by listening to artificial intelligence, or for that matter, add extra gray matter if we could? So the real transhumanist challenge is, of course, could you use this to keep up with the machines? So I think it was Elon Musk who said he doesn't want to become a house pet for the AIs. So he has been funding his company Neuralink that is working on brain-computer interfaces. Near term, that's going to be useful for paralyzed people and for understanding neuroscience. Long term, some people hope that we could become cyborgs and enhance ourselves to keep up with the super smart machines. I have some misgivings that you can do that if you're still having your squishy brain, because the brain is rather slow. Nerve signals travel around the speed of sound, while electric signals are a good fraction of light speed. And it's very easy to parallelize things in computers, in the cloud. It's much harder to parallelize things, despite the awesome parallelism already going on in here, in extra brain. But I do think linking up to machines might help us solve the value alignment problem. After all, if a robot can actually notice my emotional reaction to an idea, that might be quite useful. Even better if it could actually trace why does Anders think helping little old ladies across the street is a good thing? There is this weird concept called compassion here that seems to matter. It's linked to these other things. Oh, now I get it. That would be pretty useful. I do think that in the long run, we are going to be a technological species. We already are. We're dressed in clothes. We're wearing glasses. We're communicating across Zoom. And this is going to continue, even if it doesn't happen by 2045. I think that in 1,000 years, in 1,000,000 years, in 10 million years, we're going to be totally transformed by ourselves. It's worth noticing that we already have done it. There is something called the domestication syndrome. When we take wild animals and domesticate them, there is a particular pattern of changes that you find. They get larger eyes, they become a little bit more neoteneous, a bit more like a child version of the animal. They breed the year around. Quite often they get a blonde forelock. There is a whole host of similar properties in mammals that we domesticate. There are even genetic and neural changes that seems to carry over. And the punchline is, of course, we humans also show evidence of a domestication syndrome. It's not just that we have domesticated our pets and our cattle. We're domesticating ourselves too. In some sense, we might end up becoming as weird as anime characters in the future, which might be disturbing on many interesting dimensions. But I do think it's likely to happen. The funny part is, however, we have a say in our own evolution. The reason we're arguing about transhumans is that we can. Ants and dogs don't really have a say in how they're going to evolve. We have.
All right. I think we'll bring Martin in for some questions and comments from the virtual audience. Thank you, Anders.
Thanks, Waqas. So yeah, there's been some really great conversations going on in the chat. So thank you everyone for your contributions. The first thing that seems to be a hot topic on lots of people's lips, or lots of people have mentioned, are the initials UBI, or Universal Basic Income, which Captain Frantic and Grumpy G have both talked about. And Svetan Sankov asks, is it weird to ask about the relationship between unemployment driven by automation and the role of universal basic income for enabling education, for gaining new work, job skills. And I just wanted to add to that. I don't know if you've heard of a concept called fully automated luxury communism, which is basically this idea that the robots will do all of the work, all of the jobs that we need to do, leaving humanity to live a fully automated luxury life where we're free to pursue the arts, the sciences, whatever we want to do, and robots will kind of do all the drudgery work for us. And I don't know if you think that's a possible future or not. I'd just like to ask about your thoughts, Waqas and Anders.
So I quite often describe myself as neoliberal, but I'm all in favor of fully automated luxury communism, assuming, of course, that we can make sure that the ownership of the means of production actually are in the hand of people rather than the party. I think that is the little problem here. But I think UBI is an interesting thing because I think it's a little bit of an intellectual flypaper. And this annoys me. So I'm not an economist. I'm not actually clever enough to say anything about how feasible it is or so. But I kind of notice whenever we do this conversation, people tend to bring up UBI and get stuck in a UBI conversation. And I think there are many more possibilities for handling a very strongly automated world. So my misgiving about UBI, it's not just that I'm a Swede and I've seen a welfare state, which on one hand is very nice in some respects, but if you fall through the cracks, suddenly you're in deep trouble. Many immigrants, for example, find that they need to navigate the Swedish bureaucracy with a lot of hidden rules. And if you handle these hidden rules that everybody's too polite to mention to you, then you get all the nice benefits. Otherwise, suddenly nothing works. And nobody is impolite enough to explain to you what you're doing wrong. And you could, of course, just say, let's get rid of that bureaucracy and just give everybody the same amount of money. But again, there is a lot of devils in details. I think the real issue is how you actually frame it culturally. In some sense, we have UBI in Saudi Arabia. If you're related to the royal family, you get a lavish allowance. And there are many places where you actually do get a fair amount of money, except that they don't necessarily seem to be that nice places to live. I think a lot of it has to do how you frame what a meaningful life is. So at least up here in the north, where you have a Protestant work ethic, and you're kind of defined almost by your job. Actually, not having a job and just enjoying UBI might be so socially frowned on that it actually would feel very bad for people. I think there are some people who will always ignore it. Other people will probably actually get really distraught and might be taking bullshit jobs that actually would make them rather unhappy. I think that maybe there are other societies that could actually handle UBI really well and everybody is just lying on the beach and enjoying it. But I think we need to get closer to that fully automated luxury communism than the UBI in the world. And getting back to that flypaper idea, I think there are many more options. UBI is just something that's very similar to systems we already have. When Milton Friedman, the libertarian guy, he originally proposed this as a negative income tax because he wanted to get rid of bureaucratic red tape. And then the left has taken it up because it looks a bit like welfare. But it's probably way more interesting in totally different ideas. We probably need to actually be way more creative in this field. I'm hoping to inspire the audience to go out and come up with kind of UBI plus or UBI squared or what is of the opposite side from it.
Fantastic. Waqas, I don't know if you want me to chip in with a few more questions, because we've got some really great ones come through. These are a few people who've come through the Polymath Festival, actually, and unsurprisingly, their questions are about polymath. So Maisie asks, do you think superintelligence will eventually render polymaths futile or cause a rise in polymathy? And somebody else asks, do we think we're becoming more dependent on AI and becoming lazier, as sort of domesticating ourselves, as you say? And do you think, that will then result in less polymathic thinkers or more polymathic thinkers, because our minds will be freed from the drudgery and boring stuff to think about, and we can focus on being creative and thinking in lots of different areas?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. Again, getting back to my idea of the awkward answer to the question. So on one hand, already, if I wanted to write a novel, Shakespeare has already written a bunch of really good plays. Hemingway and a whole library of great authors have already written novels way better than what I could ever write. Would that stop me from writing a novel? As most novel writers would say, no, of course not. Even the ones that admit that they're mediocre feel a need to write a novel because it's their novel. And I think there is something interesting also about being free to explore. I think there are many of us who just get sucked in by Wikipedia and just love learning connections between things. For example, I've been last night when I should have been sleeping, I was trying to figure out, is it true that the Telemarken terrain, the granite ground in the south of Norway was once part of Amazonian craton that in current South America and kind of got on this side of a split when the continent split apart, or did it form on this side? I don't need to know this. It's just interesting and enjoyable, at least to me. And I think in a world with superintelligence, the fact that somebody might know better, because there are obviously geologists who understand this question way better than me, doesn't matter very much because we care about it. It's just like writing your own novel. On the other hand, you might want to say, yeah, there are important questions we need to resolve. We probably need to defend Earth against the asteroid impacts and the gamma ray bursts. And maybe we want to hand that definitely over to a superintelligence rather than a dilettante. But the dilettantes, maybe they should be there at least as cheerleaders for the superintelligence fixing the asteroid. I think there is this real tendency for some people to become very complacent and lazy when they see all the awesome stuff out there. And I think you need to train yourself to have your self-defense productivity, so to say, or productive self-defense. I feel that I failed a day if I haven't produced at least one page of text or some interesting tweet, or I have made something that adds to the world. I could, of course, just sit and watch YouTube all day and watch other people who do amazing experiments and explain things and read really good text. But I want to contribute something too. Even if it's not up to the standard of what I saw on YouTube, I want to show that I can push a bit back and add something to the world. And I think that might be something we want to culture, if only for keeping our own sanity.
Just to add to that, if I may, I think the important thing is to highlight, as Anders said, highlight what your priorities are, and number two, or similarly, highlight what your core values ought to be. So if there are some people that prioritize fairness above and beyond anything else, meaning. There are others that would prioritize meaning above material possession, and so on and so forth. So there is a whole diversity at the moment in the world of priorities and values. So although coming to some kind of universal consensus, as we discussed earlier, it's so complex, borderline futile, nonetheless, what we ought to do is generate a better understanding of one another, because what that does is that generates a better understanding of humanity and of the human brain and the human mind itself. And I think to add to that, I think we need to understand what makes humans humans. I mean, what really makes humans humans? Is it consciousness? Because there's a big debate, as Anders will tell you, there's a big debate even in AI, in the world of AI, around consciousness and to what extent that is possible within machines in the future or not, or whether that is a uniquely human phenomenon, or whether there is some other form of transcendental phenomenon that we ought to be connecting with. So we need to understand also that are there other traits that make us unique, like again what Anders mentioned earlier on, like emotional intelligence, empathy, social relationships, all these things that we currently seem to be having the monopoly on. We don't know whether that's going to continue that way, but these things that are currently agreed to be uniquely human attributes are ones that we ought to focus on and nurture. And in doing so, try to understand what the human mind is fully capable of. Because I think that we've probably not discovered that yet.
I think there is also something very interesting about making a list of uniquely human traits, because at this point, the zoologist is immediately going to run out and probably find some animal that has that trait just to be annoying. And meanwhile, the AI scientist is going to rush off to his computer and he's going to try to see, how do I get that into the system? The really interesting thing is, of course, what are we good for? That's the instrumental question. And then there is, how are we good? Because it might also be a good thing to have. So consciousness, for example, which totally baffles me. I might have studied neuroscience, but I have no clue what it's about. Many people seem to assume that matters because it makes it matter what happens to you. It doesn't matter what happens to an unconscious object, but a person that at least can in principle be conscious, it matters tremendously what happens to them. They have a point of view, etc. And indeed, when it comes to theories of value, if there is a machine just calculating the value of that situation is 5.34, in some sense, it doesn't have a value. Maybe it has a number, but you could argue that it's not actually experienced, that the value is 5.44. Now, the interesting part is that's not entirely clear to me. It's actually an interesting philosophical question. There are some theories, for example, in animal rights ethics, that talk about the interests of animals in such a way that consciousness, I think I can kind of cut it out from the list of ingredients and still get something that seems to have valid interest according to that ethical theory. Usually the philosopher look very horrified when I do that, but I'm willing to argue that maybe by that theory, a robot could have equal rights as some of the animals we're talking about. But getting back to your point, because I think it's very important, the final ingredient we need here when we have different priority goals is, of course, tolerance. We actually need to realize, whoa, I have this set of values and I think they're supreme, and you have a different set. Oh dear, we need to live in the same world without killing each other and with getting into others' lives too much. That, of course, leads to interesting issues, both about trust, that we can trust other people to have different values, building institutions that allow us to live parallel lives so we don't interfere too much, and of course also do hedging. So I might think that the climate is a very serious issue, and you might think that animal suffering is a big issue, and then we might do a moral trade. So you pay some money to or do things that are more green, let's say fly less, and we make a shift. I switch my diet, so I'm more vegetarian. I might not care about animal suffering in this scenario. I might think that's probably not relevant. But we're both getting what we want. We're both getting less animal suffering and less environmental emission. There are many moral trades we can do without agreeing actually about the deep morality. We might even be fundamentally uncertain about what's right, but we can still hedge things.
Sure. And the only thing I'd add to that is going beyond tolerance would be to the active pursuit of mutual understanding and respect. Because with greater understanding, if you can tolerate the other, but then you're still otherizing them. If you pursue an understanding of the other, they no longer, or they cease to become the other. They become part of you. And even if you have differences, despite that, you learn to respect those differences. So
I think respect is something that is very valuable because that also builds trust. Even if there is somebody that you're absolutely opposing, but you respect. There's some political leader that has views that you think are totally vile, but you can kind of see where he's coming from. That means that you can in some sense trust his thinking. Yeah, you're going to still be voting against him, of course, but I think it's a very powerful thing to have that respect. But that takes a lot of work to build up, hence a lot of coffee in the morning.
Yeah, so going back to the polymath question, and actually going back to your original statement, Anders, before you started the talk, which is that what people ought to really do is pursue a job that can't currently be described. Can you elaborate on that, and to what extent perhaps the idea of the polymath might be related to that?
So the most obvious thing is if you can't describe your job easily, then the engineers can probably automate it. But even many jobs that have nice descriptions are actually more complex than that. So a few years back, some colleagues of mine did this classic paper where they studied the automatability of a lot of jobs and concluded that 47% of all jobs could be automated. One can quibble endlessly about the methodology, etc. But I zoomed in on one of the jobs because I happen to know a bit about it, because I was working on a project together with the City of London and the insurance companies. And they argued that in this paper that insurance underwriters were almost 98% probable to be automated away. And I realized that that's because the job description as written is basically you take in some data from the customer, and then you calculate some prices, and then you decide whether to sign insurance. It's basically a calculation that can be done by an Excel spreadsheet. Yeah, obviously automatable, except that that's actually not what underwriters really do. A lot of it is customer service. It used to be that you needed to play golf with your customers at the Lloyd's market. But there is also an element of noticing when something is wrong. Quite a lot of the data you get into your spreadsheet is nonsense because people have slipped up and filled in the wrong entry. If you notice that something says, this is a skyscraper that 10,000 stories tall and made out of wood, somebody has slipped up. The problem here is AI is not very good at noticing that. Humans are very good at noticing this doesn't make any sense. Of course, once you notice that kind of error, you could add it to the piece of software that always screens out that and tries to correct it. But humans are great at coming up with new kinds of nonsense. And even more, of course, when you want to stretch the truth a little bit to get a lower insurance premium. So the interesting thing about these insurance underwriters was the part of the job that were not in the written description that was used in the simulation of how automated it could be are, of course, the really important ones. Customer relations at least have some kind of name, although whether that is playing golf or just being friendly, it's still a rather complicated thing that is rather hard to create a nice description. Figuring out new weird kinds of errors is even harder. And of course, in order to do that, you need to understand the world. You need to know that skyscrapers are generally not made out of wood, except that if you're also reading the right newspapers, you will know that soon there might be. People are actually working on making wooden skyscrapers. It's actually a wonderful composite material and might be both environmentally friendly and have a lot of lovely properties. So even what was an error last year might not be in 10 years' time. And at this point, of course, your general knowledge around the world, some of it is just the low-level knowledge that allows us to have common sense. But there is also a specialized one that allows you to realize, wait a minute, modern harbors, they're actually built usually on former landfills close to oceans, so you can use automated cranes. They're super vulnerable to climate change causing the oceans to rise. Oh, that's kind of relevant if you're in insurance or shipping. At this point, that extra knowledge becomes valuable. So being a polymath is a bit like being a generalist. You want to cast a big net, but then you want to be good at a few things, both so people pay you and you can pay the rent, but also as a motivator. I found that the best way for me to learn anything is to get some interesting question, and then I want to figure out the answer. And when I discovered, to my great annoyance, that nobody knows the answer, I need to research it myself. Great, now I have that energy even without the coffee. And I think this is the key part about polymathy. You actually want to find your inner motivations. And some people are polymaths in certain directions. Others are kind of all over the place. But that knowledge about information that helps you make sense of the world, including realizing where value might exist that nobody has seen yet, that's of course where your job description becomes very irrelevant. Because if you're a really good philosopher, you're going to think about something no philosopher has ever thought about. If you're a really good engineer, you're going to solve things in ways that nobody has ever done before, but you can also prove that it's totally safe and cheap. So you need to have those other parts of engineering that allow you to convince people with your blueprints, but you can also see what others don't see. And the best way of doing that is, of course, having these weird meetings between two dissimilar areas. A little bit like a piece of Norway might be a piece of Amazonia. There are sometimes these parts of the world that simply link up in unexpected ways. And they're so random that you need to cast your net very wide. So that's why I think if your job can be described, you're in trouble. Coming up with a job that cannot be described is going to be awesome.
Wow. Okay. Well, that, as you said, as you promised, you come back to that original idea of the job not being able to be described. Do we have, Martin, a time for another question or two, or shall we be wrapping up?
I think we'll just squeeze in one more, which is basically an extension of what you've both been talking about, actually, with that original proposition of, you know, train for a job that doesn't exist yet. Well, a few people are asking, well, what would you think that the job that does exist at the moment would be most resistant to AI usurpation or being taken over. So I'm trying to think, even very highly skilled professions like being a doctor or a lawyer can sometimes be replaced by a decision algorithm, or a legal AI that asks you some questions and works out what your case is. And so everything from sort of very manual jobs, manufacturing jobs can be replaced by robots, to very highly skilled jobs. So is there anything in the middle? And obviously creative jobs, the GPT-3 system generating words, generating creative content. You have algorithms that create music, for example. So is there any human endeavor, human job that you think is the most resistant currently to being taken over?
I think many jobs that have that representative point, like being a politician or prosecutor, they're pretty safe. Not just because there has to be a person there because of tradition and they wanted to represent us, but also because the kind of high status things that you don't get to change. I think the real social revolution that's probably going to cause a lot of upheaval is when artificial intelligence affects middle management. It's one thing if painters or other jobs get changed, but if middle management feels threatened, they have a big voice. They are very good at calling their MPs and writing to the Times and making it a big deal. They're going to try to resist that. And that's, of course, going to be a big battle. But I don't think it matters very much. I think actually, if you can automate away middle management, that's probably good for all of us, including the middle managers who might actually want to get to do something important. After all, management is about solving the practical problems of organization. Leadership is about solving the problems you don't know how to solve. Some of the middle management might become middle leadership, which I think is way more resistant. And again, why can't you automate that? Well, we don't even know what the problem that we need to solve are. Being able to find new problems, detecting that is also important. There is not even a term for this job, the people going around in society and noticing stuff being wrong. Sometimes we call them activists or sometimes troublemakers. But I do think there is actually real value in people who are great noticing when things are going wrong and the kind of calling for the alarm. Conversely, we might all have on the positive side, actually, when things go unexpectedly right, shouldn't there be somebody pointing out what that's happening? So again, it gets back to that evaluative aspect. Is this going as it should? Or is it failing in an unexpected way? Can we define new goals? Those jobs, I think, are pretty safe. Sometimes it might be things like being a priest, where you might also, besides the kind of spiritual aspect, you also have a problem that they need to deal with the individual, random problems their congregation has. And a lot of them are standard. Just like a doctor gets to hear about the flu all the time, a lot of priests will hear the same marital troubles. But occasionally they're going to be these really different problems, very, very unusual ones. That's actually where they earn their actual pay. So I do think that many of the jobs that exist right now, both high status and low status, are going to transform. But right next to them are going to be other jobs that are strangely unchanged. Gardeners, for example, I think they're actually going to be pretty safe. Yes, robotic gardening is probably going to happen, but we're probably mostly going to use it for agriculture. Partially because once upon a time, hunting and gathering was the way you made your food. Then we had the agricultural revolution, and hunting became a hobby for rich noblemen. And then, of course, we have turned agriculture partially into gardening. In some sense, we have turned industry into being a maker. And maybe programming is going to be kind of a nice little hobby in the future. Yeah, of course, the computers can do it better, but this is handmade code. I made it just myself.
All right, so I think on that point, we should bring this fascinating conversation to a close. Of course, we could be talking for hours, days, weeks and months on this, and we will, in our own circles, be continuing the conversation, I'm sure. And this Polymath Festival, which ends on the 14th of February, aims to do exactly this, to catalyze a shift in thinking around these things, and to kind of use these conversations to kind of allow us to reflect upon the pressing issues of our day, and to do so collaboratively, to understand different perspectives, That's the polymathic approach, to understand different perspectives, to assimilate them, and to pursue new ones. And that kind of open approach, in my view, is something that gives us the best chance in the future. So thanks again, Anders. I appreciate your time. We all appreciate your time. We at the Polymath Festival and the Da Vinci Network appreciate this partnership with the Royal Institution. And most of all, we appreciate the time of everyone out there who's watching now live and will be watching in the future. Thank you.
And just to say thank you so much to Waqas for getting in contact with me in the first place and bringing this fantastic event to us and making us all aware of the fantastic Polymath Festival. So thank you so much, Waqas. Best of luck with the rest of the festival, and do, as he says, do check out the website and look at some of the fantastic speakers and events they've got coming up. Also, a big thank you to Anders. Just absolutely fascinating stuff. I could absolutely listen to you speak for easily another 2, 3, 4 hours. It's just been really, really interesting. So thank you so much for your time. Just to remind everyone, we've got another talk coming up on Thursday at the Royal Institution, which is Dean Burnett's talking all about mental health and why your brain goes wrong and how to fix it, which should be absolutely fascinating. So without further ado, thank you all so much. As just a final thing, if you have enjoyed the talk, don't forget we do have a Just Giving, so do donate £10, £100, £1,000, however much your internal AI thinks that this event was worth to you. And yeah, just to say thank you so much again to Waqas and Anders, and we'll see you all next time. Take care. Good night.
Thank you. Live long and prosper.